Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Ranked Choice Voting for Utah Municipalities. The webinar will begin shortly. My name is Chris Hughes, and I am a member of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center consulting team. I will be your moderator for today's session. First, we need to cover a few housekeeping matters. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees with us today. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. To expand or minimize the control panel, click the orange arrow of your webinar taskbar. If you have a question or comment regarding the webinar, please type that message in the question box. Following the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of the session on utahrcv.com in about a week. Presenting today are two individuals with extensive election administration experience. Since 2006, Karen Brinson Bell has worked in election administration, including 4 years as Elections Director for Transylvania County, North Carolina, and 5 years with the North Carolina State Board of Elections Voting Systems Division. She began working with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center 2 years ago because of her experience administering ranked choice voting elections at the municipal, district, and state level in North Carolina. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center is an educational organization led by former election administrators and provides best practices and resources to allow jurisdictions to implement and administer ranked choice voting effectively and efficiently. Over the past 2 years, Karen has given testimony or analysis about this voting method to officials across the country, including in Alaska, California, Washington, Missouri, Tennessee, Virginia, and as some of you may know, Utah. Scott Hoganson has administered elections in Utah since 2002 and will lend his firsthand knowledge of the state's processes to this presentation. Currently, he's the Chief Deputy Clerk/Auditor for Utah County. From 2005 through 2012, Scott chaired the Association of Utah County Clerks Legislative Policy Committee. Also of note, Scott has earned the SARA designation from the Election Center, the National Association of Election Administrators. And now I'll turn the program over to Karen to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Our focus will primarily be on actual processes and administration of ranked choice voting, but we thought it would be helpful to give a little background first. This past legislative session, Representative Mark Roberts introduced a bipartisan supported bill to create a pilot program to permit Utah municipalities beginning in 2019 to conduct nonpartisan races using instant runoff voting, a form of ranked choice voting. HB 35 passed both chambers with nearly unanimous support. Since that time, Utah RCV has formed with Representative Roberts and other Utah leaders, including Senator Howard Stevenson, Representative Rebecca Chavez-Houck, Representative Brad Dahl, Utah County Auditor Brian Thompson, former legislator Corey Holdaway, and former Utah Republican Party Chairman Stan Lockhart. Many of these individuals are with us today and will be available to answer questions as well. Ranked choice voting is a proven method. It is used in 11 U.S. cities: Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, Santa Fe, New Mexico, San Francisco, Berkeley, San Leandro, and Oakland, California, Telluride, Colorado, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Tacoma Park, Maryland, and Portland, Maine. 12 additional cities and counties have approved RCV for use in future elections. 5 states use RCV for overseas and military voters in federal primary elections. This year, voters in the state of Maine began using RCV for all U.S. Senate and House seats, as well as its state executive and legislative primaries. Use in countries like Australia and Ireland extends back to the early 1900s. So why have these jurisdictions adopted RCV, and why is it useful for Utah municipalities? While there are numerous benefits, 3 key points stand out for Utah cities and towns. First is greater voter engagement. With RCV, the voter only needs to make one trip to the polls. Minneapolis started using RCV in 2009 to eliminate their primary election and only hold a single general election. As you can see, Minneapolis experienced low voter turnout in primaries for more than a decade prior to RCV, including 2 primaries with turnout below 15%. Participation has increased with each RCV election, and this past year grew to 42%. With more voters participating in one election, the outcome more fairly represents more voters. Additionally, as voters consider how they will rank candidates, they learn more about the issues to distinguish between their first choice, second choice, and so forth. The focus on issues leads to more civil campaigns. Campaigning becomes less negative, mainly because candidates realize quickly if they are not a voter's first choice, then they definitely want to be that voter's second choice or third choice. During Maine's use of RCV for party primaries in June, 2 candidates ran a commercial together with this very message, and the same practice has taken place in other jurisdictions. And last but not least, a critical component for Utah municipalities, candidates, and voters is the cost savings. Through our own experience administering RCV elections and by compiling information for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, we know that RCV elections are conducted much like any other election. Use of RCV, whether in Maine, California, or in Utah, may incur some costs. Software or voting equipment upgrades are one consideration. Nearly all Utah counties are in the process of moving to the latest voting systems. These costs are not due to RCV and are associated with the need to replace aging technology. The latest voting systems are RCV capable. Dominion and Unison, which are approved in Utah, have built-in RCV tabulation and are certified for use. These vendors may need to update tabulation coding to accommodate the sequential RCV counting process, and the developers are already aware of this modification. By the way, we do have Steve Bennett with us from Dominion, who will be available to also answer questions. ES&S, the vendor recommended during Utah's RFP process and selected by most Utah counties, has developed an RCV tabulation module. Representatives have quoted a price of $10,000 per Utah county, not per municipality, for this software. Similar to the 2 other vendors, ES&S needs to add sequential tabulation. We also will be checking. We had an ES&S representative who had planned to be on with us, so hopefully he will be. I can't tell at this moment, but we'll add him in for questions also if he's available. With any Utah RCV election more than a year away, development and certification can be met. We saw this as Dominion met the timetable for Santa Fe to implement back in March, and also for Maine to use ES&S's software back in June. With the tabulation modifications, Utah voter intent rules regarding skip choices or overvotes will be part of the programming. The second cost consideration would be for any additional ballot costs, such as coding or a longer ballot and postage costs. However, this is highly unlikely for any Utah municipality. Here's the RCV ballot used in Santa Fe. You can see that both the mayoral and city council contests fit easily, and in this case, the ballot also includes Spanish language instruction. This slide shows a ballot from Maine's RCV primary in June. They opted for the landscape design to include more choices and place additional contests on the other side of the ballot. With either ballot, Dominion or ES&S, there's clearly plenty of ballot real estate without incurring additional ballot costs. Other costs we identify as supplemental are not likely or are minimal for conducting RCV in Utah municipal elections. If outreach and education are already in place, then there is no additional cost. Additionally, we've seen through implementation in Maine and North Carolina, both having less than 100 days to prepare, voter education does not have to be a costly marketing campaign. In addition, in many jurisdictions, organizations like the League of Women Voters have helped educate the voters and have been partners in the education process. And while voter education is undoubtedly important, studies through the Center for Civic Design found that voters benefit most from good ballot instruction and cost-effective pieces such as flyers, voter guides, and other forms of information that are already in place in most jurisdictions. Additional poll worker training or personnel are not likely costs because of the extensive use of vote by mail in Utah. So what do these numbers look like for a Utah town with, say, 20,000 registered voters? Since counties charge a municipality a price per registered voter, the cost under the current primary and general election system is the same for each of these elections. By doing away with the primary, each town is pretty well cutting their municipal election cost in half. So with our example, 20,000 registered voters at $2 per voter is $40,000 per election. With both a primary and general, this example town currently spends $80,000 to hold town elections. With RCV, they will only have one election, so that's $40,000. We do tack on the $10,000 for the ES&S module, that's assuming they're an ES&S county. But note that the $10,000 is a county fee and therefore can be divided if more than one municipality in a county with ES&S equipment opts in. But the worst case scenario in this example is $50,000, which is $30,000 less than what this example town has been spending to hold municipal elections. Consider what a small town can do with $30,000. Combine these cost savings with greater voter engagement and more civil campaigns, and the benefits of RCV become a win-win for both the voters and the election jurisdiction. Whether it's a single seat contest like mayor or multi-seat contest like city council, the ballot layout is presented the same. Instructions indicate how many choices may be marked and how many are to be elected. Voters rank their choices in order of preference. The number of rankings depends on the capability of the voting system, which varies from 3 to all candidates, though usability studies through the Center for Civic Design also suggest that voters favor 5 to 8 rankings. Rather than only voting for one candidate, candidates are ranked according to the voter's preference. On election night, the top choices are counted first. If there is no majority winner, a series of tabulation rounds is executed where the lowest vote getter is eliminated, and that candidate's ballots are counted for their next choice. In effect, a voter's ballot can still be considered even when his or her first choice is defeated. Utah adopted a similar process for multi-winner contests, which we refer to as sequential RCV. With this process, the counting takes place as described until the first winner is declared. A new count begins by removing the first winner from consideration. The next round of counting is conducted without the first winner among the pool of candidates. From the remaining candidates, the series of tabulation rounds are conducted until a second winner is declared. This process continues until all seats are filled. And with the availability of computer tabulation, all these rounds are counted through cast vote records and the vendor's software. As ballots are tallied, the cast vote records are used to run the tabulation. Unofficial results can be announced on election night, and additional cast vote records can be imported to retabulate as additional ballots, such as provisional or UOCAVA ballots, are received. In this sense, it's no different than current Canvass procedures. Now I'd like to hand off to Scott Hoganson, who's given consideration to some specific aspects of Utah election administration and RCV.
Hello, everyone. Let's look at the first question here. Would a county have to sort out ballots for RCV cities? The answer for that is simple, and it is no, they would not. The way that the election management software works in any of the main systems, it can keep track of the individual races in the individual ballots, and it will sort them out by itself. So we would not need to do that. Think of it the same way as just programming for like a city council district or for multi-winner. It's really a rather easy thing to do. The next question is, how would tabulation differ from with RCV ballots versus non-RCV ballots? Depending upon the system used, the RCV count may need to be exported to external software to perform the count. With Unison and with Dominion, this is already built into the system, so that wouldn't need to happen with those systems. But for the system that does require that, these results would then need to be re-imported. Now, an important point to make here, and this has come up in my discussion with some of the city recorders, this can be done multiple times. This is the same as like what we do now, where you have election day and then you combine the post-election day count for things for canvass. This can be done, and the ballots only need to be run once to do it. The next question is, can RCV ballots be tabulated using high-speed scanners without separating the RCV ballots out? This question is kind of related to the first one, and the answer to that is yes, they can be run without needing to be sorted out. This is just a feature of the current generation of election management software. It can keep track of things, and it does a great job of it. So we will not need to pre-sort before we do the count. The next question, we're talking about logic and accuracy testing, recounts, and audits. This should be able to be done in just about the same way as we already do these processes. The logic and accuracy testing may be a bit more elaborate when it comes to generating the test pattern and checking it, to make sure that the ranked choice voting component comes out correctly. The recounts would be just the same. It's just you would need to do the little bit of extra work for the ranked choice voting part. And then the audits would be very similar to now. It's just you would also once again look at the results from the RCV part of it. So we already have policies and procedures in place to do logic and accuracy testing, to do recounts, and to do audits. We wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel to do any of this. We would just simply modify our procedures a bit to incorporate dealing with the RCV portion. The results reporting. Now, this is something that I think everybody will be excited about. We have been running, Utah has been running the older election system, and the system that ran that, the software, it was called GEMS. It was Dominion software. And the standard reporting results that came out of it were somewhat limited. Both Dominion and Unison and ES&S, all these systems have much more elaborate options to report data out than the old systems do. So I think as we all get into using the new equipment, the new system, we'll all be happy to see that there are new, more flexible ways we can report. The counties can do as we've usually done. We can either centrally report results off of a county website, or it should be possible. We've already always done this with some of our cities in Utah County. We just send the results to the individual cities as well, and then they have reported those on their website. the last question, and I think this is a particularly interesting question. Do ballots need to be rescanned for each round of RCV? No, they don't. They don't need to be rescanned. They only need to be scanned the once, and then the election management system and the software, it goes through and it handles that portion of it. So rest your minds, please, and don't think that you're going to be stuck there till 3 in the morning feeding ballots through 5, 6, 7 times. You only have to do it the once. And with that, I will conclude my brief comments and turn the time back to Karen.
Thanks, Scott. I hope that was helpful for everyone to hear a Utah perspective, someone who's right there in the thick of it with you, and also who understands the exact administration perspective of Utah. One last area we're going to touch on pertaining to implementation and administration of RCV is how successful voters are in marking their ballots, and also their reaction to the voting method. Let's take a quick look at data from Minneapolis and Santa Fe. Santa Fe voters used RCV for mayor and in 2 city council races. In that election, 84% of voters found the ballot easy to use. 62% of voters ranked all 5 mayoral candidates, and 94% of voters said they were satisfied with their voting experience. 70% of voters said they were very confident their vote was counted as they intended, and this is compared with a 55% response in similar November 2016 survey in New Mexico. As for actual ballot counting statistics, 96% of ballots cast counted in the final round of the mayoral election. 96%. Just 1/3 of 1% of ballots were removed due to voter error, with the other 3.7% of ballots running out of rankings for voters. Without RCV, Santa Fe would have had to run a runoff election between the top 2 vote getters. Turnout in that decisive election would have certainly dropped more than the 4% seen in the final round of their RCV election. Minneapolis has now used RCV in 3 election cycles, 2009, 2013, and 2017. I'll spend some time looking at the voter statistics for 2013 and 17 now, because those are the statistics that are available. In reviewing these statistics, it's important to note that the voters in Minneapolis are limited to 3 rankings, and that's a legislative election law issue, not anything to do with anyway. This slide shows statistics that were collected after the November 2017 election. Only 1/5 of 1% of ballots had overvote errors in 2017. On a ballot that included 35 mayoral candidates in 2013, the error rate was the same. There was also a higher percentage of repeat candidate error, often because voters felt that this could help their candidate. When reviewing whether voters ranked all 3 choices in 2013 in the various races, we can see that the mayor's race, which had 35 candidates, scored the highest with 76.3% of voters ranking 3 candidates. In 2017, 72.5% of voters used all 3 ranks. In all other races with 3 candidates or more, the majority of voters chose to rank more than 1 candidate. As in all elections, it is very important to collect this type of data for use in updating and modifying future voter education efforts. This is one of the best practices in election administration by Minneapolis. In a recent interview with the city clerk, Casey Carl, he drew a connection between RCV and best practices when he said, RCV easily opened some important doors for how we run elections. not just ranked choice voting elections, but all elections. So just a little food for thought shared by a fellow election administrator about his experience in conducting RCV elections. And I think it's now time for Chris to come back in as moderator. Chris, do we have you?
Sorry, I was muted on my end. I was talking to myself. So thanks so much to Scott and Karen, especially to Karen for pointing out that I had still muted myself. Today's webinar has been recorded and we'll hold a brief question and answer session in a few moments. The recording and supplemental Q&A document will be added to utahrcv.com in about a week. Utah RCV is also on Facebook and Twitter. And you can see that on the next slide, that contact information, unless my side is slow to update. At the end of the presentation, we'll also display contact information for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. And Karen, you mentioned that someone from ES&S had gotten on?
Yes, I believe Dan Clark came on as an attendee. I'll unmute him.
Yeah, Dan, I'm going to promote you to panelist. Just don't panic.
Sounds good. And also we have Brooke Tierney from ES&S on as well, if you can unmute her in case we have any questions.
To panelist as well.
Thank you. And we really appreciate the vendor representatives joining us today and being on hand for questions that pertain to issues that you can better address.
So I'm not seeing any questions come in just yet. Just to remind everyone, oh, actually we did just get a question from Corey. I'm sorry, I don't know how, I'm not sure if I'll pronounce your last name correctly, but Twait. Is there a process for manual tabulation of ballots for small cities? We manually tabulate the election results right now and will not be doing RCV if we have to purchase software. I'm told we can continue to tabulate manually with RCV. Has this been done and is there an established process?
I'll give a shot at that question, and we're going to touch on that some in the presentation, but we just didn't want to carry on for too long since there aren't as many jurisdictions who are hand counting in Utah. In reality, it is used as a hand counting method. Robert's Rules of Order walks you through that. There's been use at the conventions to hand count, and in a sense, Minneapolis is actually a hand count situation. They did hand count in 2009. They are not by law allowed to have the automated computer software as it stands that the vendors provide. So they have modified to where they can use the cast vote records in Excel, and that's allowed them to more efficiently semi-manually count. But they've done that because they have over 100,000 ballots cast. So in a small jurisdiction, it can easily be hand counted, and it's a matter of stacking, just doing stacks. And in the method that's been adopted by Utah, as we talked about, you do a count, you do the stacking process to determine the first winner for a city council, and then as you go back through the ballots to determine the second winner, you just would not consider the person who was declared the first winner. And we're happy to walk to be on hand or to walk you through that process for your jurisdiction or for another jurisdiction who's interested and wants to do a hand count. George?
Yeah, Karen, I just wanted to add that St. Paul, Minnesota has always hand counted their RCV elections.
Thanks for that reminder.
They have very good procedures worked out for that process, and it's a fairly straightforward process.
All right, Corey says thanks. I'm not seeing any other questions, but I had one. Can you talk a bit about, or go a bit into more detail about how provisional and absentee ballots are incorporated as the counting process continues?
Does one of the vendors want to talk about that, or?
Let me unmute them.
Yeah.
Sure, this is Stephen Bennett with Dominion. So, like any other contest that we are tallying, as ballots that are provisionals or any other ballots that are tabulated late in the process are just added into the algorithm. So, since Dominion system is fully integrated, as you add more and run ballots or run the algorithm round by round reporting, that ballot or the additional provisional ballots are just added into the totals. So it's no different than just day-to-day running ranked choice voting algorithm in the Dominion system itself, as you add day 1, day 2 totals and so forth as you're doing mail balloting or processing your mail ballots.
Great,
and
thanks. Go ahead.
This is Brooke Turnus with Election Systems and Software. Our system would behave the same. So once really all ballots have been counted, our electionware system will export a cast vote record spreadsheet. That's simply ingested into our ranked choice voting utility, and that the algorithm is applied. This process can be done as many times as needed. If more votes are counted, that cast vote record would be re-exported and then re-imported into the software. So no different process with regards to provisional and absentee.
All right, thanks to you both. And we have one more question from Brian McKenzie. Do you have any examples to share of city council elections where the officers are not elected by districts? I guess, Brian, are you asking about people being elected multiple seats at a time, something like 3 or 4 candidates at once? So Karen or George or anyone else who wants to take that question.
That's actually the experience that I had. First, I worked in a regional position for the State Board of Election and assisted the city of Hendersonville. And in their case, they had city councils that ran at large, and so it was a multi-seat race, and similar in the counting methodology that's being used for Utah. In their case, they actually never had to go to additional rounds because the candidates met the threshold in the first count, and so all the seats were filled. They had, by their law, they had a lower threshold than the 50% that's used in Utah, and that's how we were able to declare winners after the very first round of counting. Is that getting at the question, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. Could you talk a bit about how, I know we covered this in the presentation, but could you talk a little bit more again about how the round by round process is counted?
In the sequential method?
Yeah.
So it is just a repeat process of instant runoff voting. If we're looking at a mayor's contest, then you just take the first choices, see if anyone can be declared the winner. If not, then you would eliminate the last place finisher and look at that last place person's second choice, that candidate's second choices, and redistribute them to the candidate that was the second choice on those ballots and you go through those rounds of counting until you declare a winner in a single seat. And the way that the legislation was written in HB 35, now that if you apply that to a multi-seat situation, you declare a winner and for the first seat, and then you just take that person out of consideration, and that's what the computer software would do. They would take George Washington out of consideration. He's already assumed a seat, and so now you look at the remaining candidates and go through the count again and go through the additional eliminations as you need to determine until that second person gets 50% of the vote, and then they're declared the winner for the second seat. And you would just continue that process until all the seats are filled.
All right, thank you. And I have one more question from Brian, and I guess this is about the specific experience you had, Karen. Was that hand counted or was software used?
We actually, we had DRE, Ivotronic equipment, and so we were able to take the cast vote record in that situation, but we did not, at that point in time, the vendors did not have any built-in modules or tabulation. So we developed our own algorithm to take those cast vote records. It was tested by the vendor, and it was tested by a computer science department at one of the universities to make sure that it was working correctly. But it was basically taking Excel and using it as a calculator, and that was the difference. We just used Excel to determine the results.
Mm-hmm. Another question from Nicole Smedley. How are spoiled ballots processed in ranked choice voting elections?
Well, if it's a truly spoiled ballot, as in any election, then you want to ideally reissue a ballot to the voter and allow them to properly mark it. I think, as we know as election administrators, if we've received a by mail ballot that is spoiled, that's, they've marked spoiled or whatever indicator to us, then we try to reissue a ballot, or we aren't able to consider that. So it's not, in that situation, a spoiled ballot is not a matter of RCV or any other election and how it's handled. If there is a voter error on, let's say that they overvote, then perhaps they mark one candidate in all the choices. Then the rules are going to dictate that their first choice is going to count, but unfortunately, they've not given any indication of other choices. So, that at that point, that ballot's going to have counted for one, but not be able to count for the others, for example. So, I think it comes down to what are we describing as spoiled ballots, and then just how are spoiled ballots handled for any election, not just RCV.
Mm-hmm. And Ricky Hatch says he has a question. I'm not seeing your question though, Ricky, so I will wait for a few seconds and let you type that up if that's what you're still in the process of doing. And Karen, could you talk, you mentioned the repeat candidate error where people rank the same candidate multiple times, which means we're not sure how else to count that if that candidate, that person ranked multiple times, gets eliminated. What happens in Utah if someone ranks multiple candidates at the same position, or if they skip multiple rankings?
There are still the legislation does give some specificity to that, and then they also need to verify that with rules that will be approved by the state elections office, the lieutenant governor's office. I'm going to let Scott chime in and see if he wants to add to that information. And Scott, you were muting and unmuting yourself, so we can't hear you right now. And we still don't have Scott. So,
I'm still here.
There you are. Okay. Did you want to add to any of that?
No, I think that you covered it pretty well. I think that for the most part, what we just have with this is we end up doing things pretty much the same way that we've done it before. I don't think there's anything entirely new about most all of this.
All right, and I have Ricky submitted his questions, so let me read through those and then I'll relay them back to you all. Looking at the mayor race in Minneapolis, I believe in 2013, 76% of voters filled out all three choices, but for the park at large, 60.6% filled out all three choices. Is that correct? And then another question about how many people voted at all in the park district with only two candidates.
This should be the slide that we
are
referencing. And Chris, I'll let you chime in as well. I mean, I know you're serving as moderator today, but you're also very familiar with this data. And you may have to lead on it because I'm not sure that I got all of Ricky's question. So we're talking about the number of choices in the mayor's race versus the number of
the number of candidates or the number of voters who actually voted in these park board at large and mayoral races.
How many voters actually cast ballots, or what would be the reason for the difference in percentage of three choices marked?
Yeah, exactly.
I think this is a situation where, you know, it's a park, not to discredit the park board, but it doesn't, it's not at the same level. It's a down ballot race in a voter's mind. And so you see the participation in city council and mayor, and then, it begins to drop off when it's lower down ballot races. And they vote for all these seats every 4 years. They don't stagger like many other cities. So, we get then into the issue of just voter participation in general, which we've seen slump nationwide, and the fact that outside of the presidential year, voters just don't seem to, unfortunately, educate themselves. And to the good fortune of RCV, issues do become more relevant and they do start participating more. And we definitely see that in the mayor's race. And unfortunately, I don't know enough about the campaigning that takes place in the park board, but I'm not sure if that's something that voters feel as engaged about. What do you think, Chris?
Well, I know to Ricky's second question about the park district with only 2 candidates, it's just that 60%, 59.9% of voters just made a mark at their first choice, but another 37% marked 2 choices. And even though there were only 2 candidates, Minneapolis also allows write-ins, and another 3.1% of voters marked 3 choices. So that adds up to about 90% of voters who cast a ballot in Minneapolis in 2013 actually did vote in that park district with 2-candidate election. And it's pretty high too on the park district with just 1 candidate. Of course, 97% of voters marked just 1 choice because that 1 candidate was going to win. But I think you're right too, Karen, that you do still experience drop off with these sorts of races. But what we're seeing on the Minneapolis data in particular is voters are voting in 4 races using ranked choice voting on any given ranked choice voting ballot in Minneapolis. Mayor, their city council ward, the Board of Estimate and Taxation, the park board at large, and their park district. So there's 4 potential races they're voting on. And so there's not a lot of room for them to be dropping off by the time they get to the end of their RCV ballot.
And I was noticing, if you look at the 2 charts side by side, then we start seeing that there are, there's an uptick in the 2017 numbers for that park board that still has 9 candidates running at large. I think it's an aspect of just that particular position.
Right. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, but if we do get any more, and actually before we close out, Karen, did you want to put up our contact information? Yeah. I'm not seeing any more questions, but please feel free to email us at info@rankedchoicevoting.org, or is there an email address also for utahrcv.com for people to submit questions to?
I don't have a specific one to offer. There's Corey and Stan. My apologies. We can get that information out.
Yeah, well, it might just be easiest if you do have more questions, if there's anything that comes to mind later today or anytime in the next week or so, just email info@rankedchoicevoting.org with that question, and we'll be sure to add it into the Q&A document that goes out with the webinar recording. If you're interested in learning more about the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can also check out our podcast, RCV Clips, which is available through iTunes, Google Play, and anywhere else you get podcasts. Thanks again. Thanks so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.